Victor Hawthorne didn't knock. He never knocked. He walked into the county clerk's office that August morning like a man who had already decided how the story ended, because he had written every page of it himself. He dropped a stack of papers on the desk, slid a folded bill beneath them, and said 4 words that would destroy a young woman's entire future before she even understood what was happening. The Rowan debt's mine. Eliza was 20 years old. Her father had been dead 11 days. And in the time it took Victor to light a cigar and smile at the ceiling, every choice she thought she had left was gone. If that had happened to you, if someone handed you a bill and called it a life sentence, what would you have done? Don't go anywhere. Subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The morning her father died, Eliza Rowan did not cry. She wanted to. She stood at the foot of his bed in the gray pre-dawn light, her hands folded in front of her the way her mother had taught her years ago. Stand straight, Eliza. Don't let them see you fall apart. And she stared at the stillness of his chest and waited for the grief to come in the shape she expected. It didn't. What came instead was a cold, practical dread that settled in behind her ribs like a stone dropped in still water. Because Thomas Rowan had not been a careful man. He had been a kind man, warm when he was sober, funny in a way that made you forget what you were angry about. When Eliza was 9 years old, he had carried her 3 miles through mud because she'd twisted her ankle, chasing a rabbit, and he refused to let her limp home alone. She remembered that. She remembered a lot of good things about him. But kindness and warmth and a willingness to carry a 9-year-old through the mud does not pay a debt. And Thomas Rowan had debts the way some men have children, scattered and multiplying and always costing more than anyone planned. Eliza found the first ledger 2 hours after he stopped breathing. It was tucked inside his coat, hanging by the door, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. Numbers written in pencil, some of them scratched out and rewritten, none of them adding up to anything that felt like safety. She found the second ledger under the floorboard she'd known about since she was 12. The third was in the false bottom of his tobacco tin. She sat on the floor of the room they'd shared for 3 years, since her mother passed and there was no reason to keep 2 separate spaces. And she spread the papers around her in a half circle, and she did the arithmetic slowly, twice, the way her schoolteacher Mrs. Hadley had insisted. Do it twice, Eliza, once to find the answer and once to make sure you're right. The answer, both times, was the same. $462, owed to 6 different men across 2 counties. Due within 40 days of the borrower's death, per the agreements her father had signed, agreements she hadn't known existed until this moment, sitting on a cold floor with a dead man in the next room. $462. She could have worked for 2 years straight and not earned that much. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the dark thin out into gray. And she thought about every option she had, one by one, the way you count coins when you already know there aren't enough. She could appeal to the lenders. She could look for work in town. She could write to her father's brother in the East, though he hadn't responded to a letter in 6 years, and she had no reason to believe he'd start now. She was still sitting in that chair when Victor Hawthorne's hired man knocked on the door at 7 in the morning. His name was Pruitt. He was a lean, weathered man with small eyes and the particular expression of someone who delivers bad news for a living and has made his peace with it. He took off his hat when she opened the door, which she supposed was meant to soften things, and he held out a folded document without preamble. Mr. Hawthorne's consolidated the debts, Miss Rowan. All 6 notes. He's the single holder now. Eliza didn't take the paper right away. When? Yesterday afternoon. Her father had been dead less than 24 hours, and Victor Hawthorne had already been moving. Had probably been moving before Thomas Rowan drew his last breath, if she was honest about what kind of man Victor was. What does he want? She asked, though part of her already knew. Pruitt looked at his hat. He'll give you 30 days. After that, the law allows him to collect in any manner the court approves. She took the paper. She read it on the porch while Pruitt waited, and the morning warmed around her in a way that felt insulting. Birds, a light breeze, the kind of summer day that had no right to be pleasant. 30 days. She went inside without another word, and she sat back down in her chair, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, hard enough to see color, and she let herself have 5 minutes of something that wasn't quite crying but was close to it. 5 minutes. Then she stopped, because there wasn't time. Victor Hawthorne owned the largest spread in 2 counties, had the county judge in his pocket, and had never in his adult life lost a legal dispute. He had bought her father's debts not because he needed $462, that amount was nothing to a man like Victor, but because he wanted the quarter-acre lot the Rowan house sat on. It sat at the edge of a creek that fed into the upper Ashcroft water line, and water, out here, was worth more than gold. That was the part that made the stone in her chest heavier. He didn't need the money. He didn't even particularly need the land. He just wanted the water access, and she and everything she owned were simply in the way. She heard about Silas Ashcroft the same afternoon, from old Mrs. Carver at the dry goods store, who told her the way old women tell things, leaning in, voice low, as though the walls had opinions. "The Ashcroft man's been looking for a wife," Mrs. Carver said. "Serious looking. Sent word to 2 towns over." Eliza set down the bolt of cloth she was pretending to examine. "What happened to his first wife?" Mrs. Carver's expression did something complicated. "Fever. 3 years ago. They say he hasn't spoken more than 20 words in a row since." "They say a lot of things." "They do. But in this case, Eliza, I think they might be right." She paused. "He owns the Ashcroft mountain range outright. Good stock. Good water." She caught herself and looked away. "Good land." Eliza walked home. She walked slowly, which wasn't like her because she was usually a fast walker. Her father had always teased her about it, said she moved like she was late for something even when she had nowhere to be. But that afternoon she walked slowly, and she thought about water and debt, and what a woman's choices actually looked like when you stripped away everything that wasn't real. She wrote a letter that evening. She wrote it plainly, without decoration, because she had no talent for decoration, and because she suspected that a man who spoke less than the wind would see through anything that wasn't plain. "My name is Eliza Rowan. I am 20 years old. I am in debt, and I have no family, and I know how to work. I am not looking for affection, and I will not pretend otherwise. I would be a reliable partner and an honest one. I will not waste your time if you will not waste mine." She almost didn't send it. She held the sealed envelope for a full minute over the lamp flame, not quite touching it to the fire, her hand steadier than she felt. Then she put on her coat and walked it to the post herself. Silas Ashcroft's reply came in 11 days, which was faster than she expected from a man who allegedly didn't talk much. It said, "Come Saturday? We'll see." That was it. No pleasantries, no promises. "Come Saturday? We'll see." Eliza read it 3 times, looking for a hidden meaning, and eventually decided that the absence of one was the meaning. She showed Mrs. Carver, who pressed her lips together and said it sounded like a man who meant what he said. "That can be a good thing," Mrs. Carver said carefully, "or a very hard thing." "Either way," Eliza said, "it's better than 30 days in Victor Hawthorne." She told herself that every morning that week. She told herself that on Saturday, when she put on her one good dress, the blue one with the mended hem, she hoped wasn't noticeable from a distance. She told herself that on the wagon ride up the mountain road, sitting beside a driver who didn't talk, and looking at a landscape that got wilder and less forgiving with every mile. She stopped telling herself that the moment she saw Silas Ashcroft standing outside the courthouse. He was taller than she'd expected. She hadn't thought to expect anything, but there it was. He wore a dark coat that had been good once and wasn't anymore, and he stood the way men stand when they've spent years outdoors, and their bodies have simply decided that posture is beside the point. He wasn't looking at her when the wagon pulled up. I was looking at the courthouse steps like he was calculating something, and when he finally turned his eyes toward her, she had the unsettling sensation that he was calculating her too. He didn't smile. She hadn't expected him to. He looked at her the way you look at weather, not with judgment, just with the particular attention of someone who needs accurate information. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, because she wasn't starting this thing by waiting to be helped, and she walked up to him and held out her hand. "Eliza Rowan," she said. He shook it. His hand was rough in a way that came from genuine work rather than performance. "Silas Ashcroft." He paused, and the pause lasted long enough that she wondered if that was all she was getting. Then, "You look like you mean it." She blinked. "Mean what?" "The letter." He didn't elaborate. He just turned toward the courthouse door and held it open, which was either gallantry or efficiency, and she genuinely couldn't tell which. The ceremony took 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. The judge was a young man with ink stains on his fingers who read the words like he was reading a livestock invoice. Not unkindly, just without particular ceremony. And there were exactly 4 people present, including the 2 of them and the required witnesses, a pair of older men from town who signed the paper and left without making eye contact with either of them. When it was done, Silas signed the ledger, she signed the ledger, and he settled the full $462 with Victor Hawthorne's agent, who was waiting on the courthouse steps, because of course he was, without expression. The agent counted the bills twice, folded them, and walked away. Eliza stood on the courthouse steps in her blue dress with the mended hem and watched the agent go, and she thought, this is either the worst decision I have ever made or the only decision I had. She didn't know yet. She wouldn't know for a while. The wagon ride to the ranch was 3 hours and mostly silent, which was not surprising given what she knew about the man sitting 2 feet to her left. The road climbed steadily, and the air changed, cooler, thinner, carrying the smell of pine and something else she couldn't name right away. It took her almost an hour to place it. Water, moving water. Somewhere below them, the river ran fast and cold and constant, and the sound of it came up through the trees like a presence. Silas drove with one hand loose on the reins and his eyes on the road. Once, a hawk crossed above them, and he tracked it without turning his head, just moving his gaze in a slow arc, and Eliza had the feeling that very little happened in his peripheral vision that he missed. She asked him one question on that ride, not because she was testing him, but because she genuinely needed to know. "The room," she said. "We discussed, in your letter you mentioned—" She stopped because she hadn't planned this part, and it came out less cleanly than she wanted. He waited. "Separate arrangements," she finished. "I want to make sure that's still—" "It is," he said. Not defensive, not embarrassed, just stating a condition of the world the same way he'd state the condition of a fence. She nodded once and didn't bring it up again. The ranch appeared around a bend in a way that didn't announce itself. No dramatic reveal. The road simply curved, and there it was. The main house, low and solid, built close to the ground, the way structures built by practical people in difficult places tend to be. A barn, large and slightly leaning on the east side. 3 outbuildings she couldn't identify at this distance. A split-rail fence running along what she assumed was a property line. Missing boards in 2 places she could see and probably more she couldn't. It was not pretty. She had not expected pretty. What she had not expected was the smell of pine smoke from the chimney, thin and clean, or the way the late light caught the mountain behind the house and turned the rock face a color between gold and amber that didn't have a good name in any language she knew. Silas stopped the wagon. He climbed down, looped the reins, and came around to her side. He didn't hold out his hand this time. He just stood there while she climbed down herself, the same as before, and she appreciated that he'd understood that was how she did things. He walked her through the front door and down a short hallway and stopped at a door on the left. "This is yours," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a key, just one, by the look of it, and held it out to her. She took it. "The lock's new," he said, which she understood to mean he had put it in specifically for this purpose. Not repaired. New. She turned the key over in her hand. It was a simple thing, iron, slightly warm from his pocket. And she thought, standing in a strange house on a mountain at the end of the strangest day of her life, that it was the most genuine offer anyone had made her in a long time. Not a promise, not a performance, just a door with a lock and the key that opened it, handed to her without condition. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure yet what shape the gratitude was supposed to take. "I'll start on whatever needs doing first thing tomorrow," she said instead. He nodded, like that was exactly the right answer, and walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen, and she heard the particular sound of a man who is accustomed to a quiet house moving through it with practiced care, not making noise because noise was something he'd learned to be sparing with. Eliza stepped into the room, set her small bag on the chair beside the narrow bed, and stood for a moment in the last light coming through the window. The mountain was still out there, enormous and indifferent and older than every problem either of them had. The pine trees moved once in a wind she couldn't feel through the glass. She locked the door. Not because she was afraid, because she could. Because someone had put a lock on a door and handed her the only key, and that was more than the last 6 months of her life had offered her. She sat on the edge of the bed, which was harder than she was used to but not unbearable. And she pressed her palm flat against her knee, and she let herself feel it. All of it. The courthouse. The agent's face counting the bills. Mrs. Carver's careful voice. Her father's ledgers spread across a cold floor. She sat with it for a while, and then she lay down, and she did not cry herself to sleep. She just slept. Deeply and without dreams, and for the first time in 11 days, without listening for the sound of debt knocking on the door. That was the first night. She did not know yet what the first morning would ask of her. She did not know what Silas Ashcroft was carrying behind those careful eyes. She did not know that $462 had not satisfied Victor Hawthorne, that it had in fact done the opposite, that a man who had expected to walk away with water rights in a creek lot did not forget being outmaneuvered, even legally, even cleanly. She didn't know any of that yet. She just slept. And the mountain stood outside the window and kept its own counsel, the way mountains do. The first morning on the Ashcroft ranch did not ease her in gently. Eliza woke before the light changed, which was a habit from her father's house where the roof leaked near the east wall, and rain had a way of finding her face before she had time to prepare for the day. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar dark, listening to the sounds of a place that wasn't hers yet. The creak of the main beam settling, wind moving through pine trees outside. Something small and fast running across the roof. Then she got up, because lying in bed waiting for courage had never once worked for anyone she'd ever known. She found the kitchen by following the smell of a fire that had already been lit, which meant Silas had been up before her, which meant she was already behind in a race she hadn't known she was running. I was at the stove. He didn't turn around when she came in, but she had the feeling he'd heard her coming down the hall. Not because he was suspicious, but because he was the kind of man whose ears had been trained by years of listening to a mountain that occasionally tried to kill him. "Coffee," he said, which was both an offer and a statement of what was available. "Thank you." She poured her own cup and stood at the window and looked at what daylight was doing to the property. What daylight was doing to the property was not being particularly kind. The east fence was down in at least 3 places she could count from here. The water trough near the barn had a dark waterline stain that suggested a long, slow leak. The garden plot, if it had ever been a garden plot, was so thoroughly reclaimed by weeds that she had to look twice to find the old row lines pressed into the dirt, like the memory of something that had once been cared for. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. Silas drank his coffee. 3 years, give or take, since his wife died. She didn't say that. He didn't either. "What's the worst of it?" she asked instead. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he set his cup down and said, "The south fence and the water line from the upper spring. Everything else is bad, but it's manageable bad. Those 2 things are the kind of bad that gets worse if you wait." "Then we start there." He looked at her for the first time that morning. Not startled, exactly. More like he was recalibrating something. "The south fence is 4 miles of post and wire." "I didn't say it would be fast," she said. "I said we start there." He picked up his cup again. "All right." That was how their days began taking shape, not through any conversation about roles or responsibilities, but through the simple mechanics of 2 people looking at the same problem and both deciding to walk toward it. Eliza had expected to be assigned tasks, the way a hired hand is assigned tasks. What she got instead was something closer to a working partnership, which was either a sign of Silas's practicality or his loneliness or both, and she didn't spend much time trying to sort out which. The south fence took 11 days. They worked from first light until the light failed, pulling rotted posts, cutting new ones from timber at the edge of the property, tamping them into ground that was harder in some places than iron and softer in others than she expected. Her hands blistered on day 2, and she didn't mention it. By day 4, the blisters had become something harder that wasn't quite callous yet, but was getting there, and by day 6 she had stopped noticing them at all, which was either toughness or a concerning degree of numbness, and she chose to consider it the former. Silas worked beside her without commentary. He was not, she discovered, a man who withheld speech because he was unfriendly or cold. He withheld it the way some people withheld salt, not stingily, but carefully, because he understood its value and didn't want to waste it. When he said something, it meant something. When he didn't say anything, there wasn't anything that needed saying. She found to her own surprise that she didn't mind it. She had grown up with a father who filled silence with noise the way some people fill a leaking boat with anything available, and the quiet on the mountain felt less like absence than like space. On the seventh day of fence work, she asked him about the upper spring. "The water flow's been dropping," she said. They were eating lunch, dried beef and bread, sitting on the tailgate of the work wagon because there was nowhere better to sit. "I've been watching the trough level for a week. It's not keeping up the way it should." Silas chewed slowly. "I know. Do you know why?" Another pause. "I have a suspicion." She waited. "The creek bends north about 2 miles up," he said, "past the ridge. There's an old diversion point up there from when the Garver family used to run cattle on the upper pasture. They sold 20 years ago. Nobody should be touching that water." "But someone is." He looked at the tree line rather than at her. "Somebody's been touching it for a while." "Victor Hawthorne's land runs up that far?" Silas said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She filed that away. She didn't push it because she'd learned in 7 days that pushing Silas Ashcroft produced nothing useful. He moved at his own pace on things that mattered to him, and the velocity of that movement was not something you could influence from outside. But she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be returned to later, and she went back to eating her bread, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The waterline repair was harder than the fence. The pipe, iron, older than either of them, had corroded in 2 places and cracked in a third, and getting to it meant climbing to a section of the property that Eliza had not yet visited, a steep northeast face where the pines grew close together and the ground was uneven and littered with rocks that shifted underfoot in a way she had to concentrate to navigate. Silas went first. He moved up that slope the way water moves downhill, not hurrying, not hesitating, just following the path of least resistance with the confidence of something that belongs in that environment. Eliza followed. She slipped twice, caught herself both times, and did not ask for help. Silas did not offer it, which she appreciated. At the top of the climb, where the spring emerged from a crack in the rock face and fed into the iron pipe system, Silas stopped and crouched and pointed without speaking. She crouched beside him and looked. The diversion. It was not subtle. Whoever had done it hadn't bothered with subtlety. A hand-cut channel, maybe 3 feet wide, had been carved into the earth 30 yards upstream of the pipe intake. It was old work, the edges weathered and the bottom silted, which meant it had been there for years, maybe many years. And it was directing a substantial portion of the spring flow west, away from the Ashcroft pipe system, toward a drainage that ran down the other side of the ridge, toward Victor Hawthorne's land. Eliza stared at it for a long time. "How long?" she finally said. "Longer than I knew about it," Silas said. His voice was flat and quiet, in the way that wasn't calm, but was what lived on the other side of calm, after a person has processed a thing enough to stop being actively angry about it and started being something colder. "This is why the herd numbers are off," she said. "The east pasture's been dry. The horses—" "Clara's barely eating." He said the name like it cost him something. The pregnant mare in the south barn, the one Eliza had been monitoring since her second day on the property, because something about the animal's gait had seemed off to her from the beginning. "She needs more water than she's getting, and there isn't more to give right now." Eliza stood up. She looked at the cut channel, and then at the pipe intake, and then at the ridgeline, and then back at Silas. "We can redirect it," she said. "Block the diversion channel and push the flow back to the intake. It's an afternoon of work. It's also Hawthorne's water now, legally or close enough that he'll say so in court." "It's your water," she said. "That spring is on your land. I'd want to see the survey that says otherwise." Silas looked at her. "That's a dangerous position to take with a man like Victor." "I know." She meant it. She was not naive about what kind of danger Victor Hawthorne represented. She'd watched him consolidate her father's debts in under 24 hours. She understood the speed and scope of what that man could do when motivated. But the mare needs water. The herd needs water. If we lose the spring flow through this winter, we lose cattle. And if we lose cattle, we lose the ranch, he finished. "So we redirect the water," she said. He stood up. He looked at the channel for a moment in that way he had of looking at things he was deciding about. Then he picked up the shovel she hadn't noticed him carrying until now. He'd brought it without telling her, which meant he'd already made the decision before she'd weighed in, and he'd just been waiting to see if she'd arrive at the same place. "Other end," he said, handing her a second tool, a mattock that had been leaning against a pine trunk. They blocked the diversion and redirected the flow in 4 hours. By the time they climbed back down the ridge, the light was going orange, and the sound of running water through the pipe was audibly stronger than it had been that morning. It was a small victory. It was also, she suspected, the kind of small victory that announces a larger war. She was right about that. 3 days later, one of Victor Hawthorne's men rode onto the property. Not Pruitt this time, a younger man, broad across the shoulders, with the particular expression of someone delivering a message he didn't write and isn't responsible for. He handed Silas a folded letter from horseback, without dismounting, which was either efficiency or a deliberate statement about how long he intended to stay. Silas read it standing in the yard. His face didn't change. He folded it, put it in his pocket, and looked up at the rider. "Tell him I got it," he said. The rider left. Eliza waited until the sound of hooves was gone. "What does it say?" Silas took it out and handed it to her. The letter was short. Victor Hawthorne, writing in the third person through what was clearly a lawyer's hand, wished to inform Mr. Ashcroft that the water diversion on the northeast ridge had been in continuous use for 18 years and had therefore established legal precedent as a right-of-use easement. Any interference with said diversion would be considered destruction of property and prosecuted accordingly. Furthermore, Mr. Hawthorne wished to remind Mr. Ashcroft that the current land surveys of the Upper Ashcroft Range were last conducted in 1861 and were therefore subject to review and potential correction. Eliza read it twice. The second time she felt her jaw tighten in a way she recognized. It was what her face did when she was frightened and didn't want it to show. "Subject to review and potential correction," she said. "He's threatening to challenge your survey." "He's done it before," Silas said. "Different man, 8 years ago. He tried to push the boundary line south on the Garner property. They couldn't afford to fight it." "What happened to them?" He said nothing. "Silas." "They left," he said. "Took what they could carry." She handed the letter back to him. "What do you want to do?" He looked at the letter, then folded it again in the same creases, a careful automatic movement. "I want to keep the water and keep the land." "Then we need to know what your actual survey says," she said. "And we need to know who conducted it and whether any copies exist outside of what Victor can reach." He looked at her with that recalibrating expression again, the one she'd started to recognize as his version of surprise, stripped down to its minimum. "You think about things like that." "My father owed money to 6 different men," she said. "I had to learn to think about paper and who holds it." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. She was not expecting warmth from Silas Ashcroft on day 15 of knowing him, but something adjacent to it. A recognition of something. "The survey records are in the county seat," he said, "archived with the land office. There's a copy somewhere in the house too, but I haven't seen it in years." "We find both," she said, "before he does." In the second week of that search through the ranch's accumulated paperwork, a search conducted in evenings after the day's work was done, at the kitchen table with a lamp between them and documents spread across the surface in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of her father's ledgers on that cold floor, she learned more about Silas Ashcroft than she had in all the working hours combined. Not through conversation, through what she found in the papers. She found receipts for fence materials and feed and cattle medicine, all of them dated from the years before his wife died, all of them written in 2 different hands, his careful angular print, and a softer cursive she didn't recognize that appeared on the margins of some documents, small notes, reminders. Once a drawing of a bird in the corner of a water usage record that had no practical purpose at all and must have been put there simply because someone felt like drawing a bird. She didn't say anything about it. But she set those documents aside from the others without thinking about it, and later when she noticed what she'd done, she thought about why, and couldn't fully explain it to herself. She found the land survey on the 14th evening of searching. It had been folded inside a larger document, a grazing rights agreement with a neighboring rancher that was itself folded inside a leather portfolio she'd found at the bottom of a trunk in the back room. The survey was dated 1859, not 1861 as Victor's letter had implied, and it had been conducted by a surveyor named Elias Pruitt. Not the same Pruitt who'd come to her door, she thought, but possibly a relation. And it clearly, unmistakably, placed the northeast ridge and the spring intake entirely within the bounds of Ashcroft land. She set it on the table. Silas looked at it for a long moment. "He said 1861, she said. "Why 1861? Because the 1861 survey was done by a man he had business with, Silas said slowly. If there was ever a discrepancy between the two, he'd use the later one. She leaned back in her chair. He's known about this survey. He knew it would contradict any claim he made, so he pushed the date in his letter. Tried to make you think the 1859 document was the older, less reliable one. He might have assumed I didn't know the difference, or that you didn't have the document anymore. She looked at him. We need to get a copy of this to the county land office before he has a chance to... A sound stopped her. From outside. Not wind, not the normal nighttime sounds of the ranch. A different sound, lower, with heat in it. Silas was already moving. The barn was on fire. Not the whole barn. Not yet. The east corner, where the hay storage ran along the outside wall, was burning with the fast appetite of dry summer grass and aged wood, and the light of it painted the dark yard in jumping amber. Eliza ran for the water pump. Silas ran for the barn doors because Clara was inside, and a pregnant mare in a burning barn is a disaster that doesn't wait for you to finish thinking about it. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not heroic in any organized way. It was frantic and disorganized, and twice Eliza dropped the bucket she was carrying because her hands were wet and shaking simultaneously. And once Silas went back into the smoke for a reason she couldn't see, and came out coughing with both hands occupied and blood on his forearm from something she didn't have time to ask about. The neighboring rancher, a man named Holt, who lived 2 miles east and must have seen the light from his property, arrived with his 2 sons and 3 more buckets, and the 4 of them, 5 including Silas, who kept working with blood on his arm, got the fire down to smoke before it reached the main structure. Clara made it out. She was wild-eyed and lathered, and Silas walked her in tight circles in the yard for 20 minutes afterward, his hand on her neck, his voice low, saying something Eliza couldn't hear from where she stood catching her breath with her hands on her knees. Holt stood beside her. He was a compact man in his 50s, weathered in a way that spoke of actual weathering rather than affectation, and he looked at the scorched barn wall with the expression of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and knew what it meant. That didn't start by accident, he said. No, she agreed. Ashcroft make any enemies recent? She looked at the east corner of the barn, still smoking, and thought about the letter in Silas's pocket. Not recent, she said carefully. Holt looked at her. Then he looked at the mountain, dark above them, and said nothing more about it. When Holt and his sons left, Eliza went to the pump and washed her face and arms, and stood for a while with wet hands and looked at the sky, which was still doing what sky does regardless of what happens beneath it, holding its stars, minding its own concerns, offering nothing. She heard Silas walk up behind her. He stopped a few feet away. The survey, she said. We take it to the land office tomorrow, first thing. It's a day's ride. Then we leave before light. He was quiet for a moment. You're not going to ask if I think it was Hawthorne. I know it was Hawthorne, she said. Asking wouldn't change anything. No, he said. It wouldn't. She turned around. His face was smudged with smoke, and he'd wrapped something around his forearm, a strip of his shirt, and the blood had soaked through it in a pattern she didn't like. You need to let me look at that. It's fine. Silas. He looked at his arm like he'd forgotten about it. Sit down, she said. I'll get the kit. He sat on the edge of the pump trough. She found the medical kit, basic, inadequate in several ways she noted for future reference, and she cleaned the gash on his forearm, which was deeper than she'd hoped, but not deep enough to be immediately dangerous, and she wrapped it properly while he sat still and looked at the dark yard. You went back in for the survey, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd understood, seeing his hands when he came out of the smoke. The land office copy might be altered, he said. I wasn't leaving the only clean version in a barn with a fire in it. She tied off the bandage. That was stupid. Probably. Don't do it again. He looked at her then, and for a moment the careful distance he maintained around himself, the practiced quiet that kept the world at a polite arm's length, shifted just slightly. Not gone, just less solid than usual. You stayed out here fighting the fire, he said. You didn't have to do that either. I live here, she said simply. She hadn't planned to say it that way. She hadn't even thought about it. It came out the way true things sometimes come out when you're too tired for anything else. And once it was in the air between them, she felt the weight of it settle in a way that was uncomfortable and also, she thought, probably accurate. She put the medical kit away and went back to the house, and she sat at the kitchen table with the survey document in front of her, and she read it again, every line, memorizing the measurements and the names and the dates, because paper could burn and memory couldn't, and from this point on she intended to carry both. Outside, she could hear Silas checking the barn a final time, his footsteps moving in the methodical pattern of someone who is making absolutely certain before he lets himself stop for the night. She thought about what Holt had said. That didn't start by accident. She thought about Victor Hawthorne in that county clerk's office, 11 days after her father died, sliding a folded bill beneath a stack of papers like it was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he'd been writing for years. She thought about the families Silas had mentioned, the ones who'd taken what they could carry and left. She thought about the key in her pocket, the one Silas had given her the first night, the one she'd carried since without thinking about it, just a piece of iron that had become part of the ordinary weight of her days. She was not going to become one of the families who left. She had decided that without quite deciding it, the way you sometimes find that a choice has already been made somewhere inside you before your conscious mind gets around to ratifying it. She closed the survey carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest, where she would know immediately if anyone tried to take it. Then she blew out the lamp. The ranch settled around her in the dark. The mountain was out there, doing what it did, sitting, enduring, keeping its own history in the rock and water and the spaces between trees where the wind moved without asking anyone's permission. She was still awake an hour later when she heard Silas finally come inside, his footsteps moving down the hall in that careful, practiced quiet, past her door without pausing, to the room at the end. She lay in the dark with the survey against her chest and thought about water and law and paper and fire, and what kind of man sends someone to burn a barn in the night, rather than saying plainly what he wants in the daylight. She thought about Clara, the mare, walking in circles in the yard with Silas's hand on her neck. She thought about a drawing of a bird in the margin of a water usage record. And she thought about the fact that she had said, "I live here," without any hesitation at all, which was something she had not expected to be true so soon, or possibly ever, and which was either a sign that she was adapting faster than she'd given herself credit for, or a sign that the mountain had a way of making certain things clear before you were ready for them. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep with her coat on, the survey tucked inside it, the key in her pocket, and the smell of smoke still in her hair from a fire that someone had started to frighten them into surrendering. She was not frightened. She was something else, something that didn't have a clean name yet, a mixture of furious and determined and more awake to the shape of this fight than she had been 24 hours ago. Outside, a night bird called once from the pines and did not call again. The ranch was quiet. The water ran through the repaired pipe in the dark, cold, and steady, 2 miles up the ridge, doing what water does when no one is diverting it away from where it belongs. It ran where it was supposed to run. For now. They rode out before the sky was fully light, the survey document pressed against Eliza's chest inside her coat, the horses moving through a morning that smelled of pine resin and the previous night's smoke still clinging to their clothes like an accusation. Silas didn't talk on the ride down, neither did she. There wasn't anything to say that the fire hadn't already said more clearly than either of them could have managed with words. She watched the road and the tree line and the places where the road curved close to the ridge edge, and she kept her hand near the inside pocket of her coat without thinking about it, the way you keep your hand near something that matters. The county seat was a town called Harlan's Crossing, which was larger than it sounded and noisier than the mountain had prepared her for. They arrived mid-morning when the main street was at its most populated, and Eliza felt the particular attention of a small town turning toward 2 people who had ridden in from the direction of the Ashcroft Range, which was apparently a direction people noticed. The land office was a narrow building between a feed store and a lawyer's office. The proximity of the last 2 felt significant, though she couldn't have said exactly why. The clerk inside was a thin man in his 40s named Garvey, who had the permanently cautious expression of someone whose job had taught him that most people coming through his door wanted something they weren't supposed to have. Eliza placed the survey on his counter before Silas could speak. "We need this document officially logged and the date of its submission recorded," she said. "We also need to examine any other surveys on file for the Ashcroft Range, specifically anything dated 1861. Garvey looked at the document. He looked at her. He looked at Silas. "You the Ashcroft?" "I am," Silas said. "And you're his wife," Eliza said. She said it without hesitation, which surprised her slightly. Garvey pulled the survey toward him and examined it with the particular quality of attention that suggested he was buying time rather than reading. His eyes moved across the page, but they were moving too fast to be absorbing anything. "I'll need to check the existing files," he said. "Please do," she said. He went into the back room. She and Silas stood at the counter and didn't look at each other. She could hear Garvey moving through filing cabinets, the sound of drawers opening and closing, and once a pause that lasted long enough to be meaningful. He came back with a single folder. He set it on the counter and opened it with the deliberate movements of a man trying to control the pace of something. Inside was a survey, dated 1861. She picked it up before Garvey could object. She read the boundary lines. She looked at the surveyor's name, a man named Colt Drever, which meant nothing to her. She looked at the northeast ridge coordinates. They were different from the 1859 survey. Not dramatically, not in a way you'd notice if you weren't looking for it. The line had moved approximately 40 yards south at the ridge crest, which on paper was a small adjustment, and on the ground meant the spring intake fell on the wrong side of the boundary. "Who filed this?" she asked. Garvey's eyes moved sideways. "It would have been the party who commissioned the survey." "That's not what I asked." A pause that went on several seconds too long. "The filing record shows it was submitted by an agent acting on behalf of Mr. Victor Hawthorne." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the street noise outside. A wagon, someone shouting at a dog. She set the 1861 survey down. She picked up the 1859 one. She placed them side by side on the counter. "This survey predates that one by 2 years," she said. "It was conducted by a licensed surveyor and has been in continuous possession of the Ashcroft family. Under territorial land law, the prior survey takes precedence when boundaries conflict, provided the original document can be produced." She had read that in one of her father's old legal pamphlets 3 years ago, for no particular reason, and she had never been more grateful for an idle hour in her life. "We are producing it, today. Log the submission time." Garvey looked at Silas, who was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing in particular. "Log it," Silas said. Garvey logged it. They left the land office with a receipt that Eliza folded and placed in a separate pocket from the survey. Walking back toward the horses, she became aware that Silas was looking at her with that recalibrating expression for the third or fourth time since she'd arrived on the mountain, and she was beginning to understand that for him this was a significant look, that it meant something had shifted in his internal accounting of a situation. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "The legal part." "My father's debts came with paperwork," she said. "I read everything I could find about property law when I was trying to figure out if there was any way out." "Was there?" "Not for him," she said. "Maybe for us." She didn't realize until she'd said it that she'd used us, and by the time she noticed, they were at the horses and the moment for remarking on it had passed. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that Garvey had a second door in the back of that office, and that 20 minutes after they left, he used it. They found out 8 days later when a man named Caro arrived at the ranch with 2 others and a letter bearing the seal of the Territorial Circuit Court. Caro was a process server by profession, and a careful one. He handed the document to Silas at the gate rather than approaching the house, which was either procedural habit or a sign that he'd been told to keep his distance. The letter informed Silas Ashcroft that Victor Hawthorne had filed a formal boundary dispute with the Circuit Court, citing the 1861 survey as the controlling document and requesting an injunction against any use of the Northeast Spring pending judicial review. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks hence. 6 weeks. Silas read it twice and handed it to Eliza without comment. She read it once. "He filed within 8 days of us logging the 1859 survey," she said. Garvey told him. Garvey told him. She folded the letter. 6 weeks isn't much time." "No," Silas said. "It isn't." Caro and his companions had ridden out by then, and the yard was quiet in the way that follows bad news, a particular silence that feels different from ordinary silence, heavier, with a texture to it. Silas looked at the mountain above them. She looked at his profile and thought about what she'd read in those old legal pamphlets, and what she hadn't read, and what she was going to need to find out in 6 weeks with limited resources and no lawyer and a filing clerk who reported to the opposition. "I need to know every family Hawthorne has done this to," she said. Silas turned. Not just Garner, she said. Everyone. Every property dispute, every survey challenge, every ranch that came up against him and lost. If he's done this to us, he's done it to others. And if he's done it to others, some of them kept records. Silas was quiet for a moment. Holt might know some names. Then we start with Holt. Holt knew 4 names. One of those 4 knew 3 more. By the end of the second week, they had spoken to 11 families across 2 counties, and what they found was not a collection of isolated incidents, but a pattern so consistent it almost had a rhythm to it, a kind of terrible predictability that was in some ways worse than random cruelty, because it suggested design, planning, a man who had been doing the same thing for years with the quiet confidence of someone who has never been stopped. Victor Hawthorne's method was not complicated. He found properties with water access he wanted. He used surveyors he controlled to file amended boundaries. He used the delay of legal proceedings to pressure families who couldn't afford to wait, couldn't afford lawyers, couldn't afford to miss a season of productivity while the courts took their time. Most of them didn't fight. They couldn't. And the ones who tried to fight found that the circuit judge, a man named Arbeth, who had been on the bench for 11 years, had a particular habit of ruling in Hawthorne's favor on procedural grounds before the substance of a case could be heard. Judge Arbeth. She wrote his name down. She wrote everything down. The third week brought a different kind of trouble. Clara went into labor 3 weeks early, which was not a disaster by itself. Early labor in a healthy mare was manageable. But the foal presented wrong, turned sideways in a way that made what should have been difficult into something that edged close to life-threatening for both of them. Silas was in the barn before Eliza had finished pulling on her boots, and what followed was 4 hours that she would remember for a long time, not with clarity exactly. Stress doesn't preserve things cleanly, but in fragments. Silas's hands, steady in a situation that had no use for anything that wasn't steady. Her own hands doing what he told her to do, and then doing things he didn't have to tell her because she could see what was needed. The mare's breathing, ragged and then evening out. The foal, finally, after a passage of time that felt much longer than 4 hours, arriving in the way that new things arrive. Abruptly, all at once, after an eternity of not being here, and then suddenly being here. The foal was a pale gray that would probably darken. He was unsteady and damp and very loud about his opinions of the world. Clara turned and looked at him with an expression that contained everything about the situation that needed to be said. Silas sat back against the barn wall. He was exhausted in a way that he didn't usually show, the careful composure slightly undone at the edges, and he looked at the foal for a long moment without speaking. "She did well," Eliza said. She was sitting on the other side of the stall, her back against the boards, her arms resting on her knees. "She always does," he said. Something in his voice had a different quality than usual, softer in a way she associated with things he didn't normally say out loud. She looked at him. "Was she your wife's horse?" He didn't answer right away. The foal made a sound and Clara nudged him with her nose. "She was a wedding gift," he said finally, "from a neighbor who thought a young woman living on a mountain ought to have a horse of her own choosing." A pause. Margaret named her Clara because she said it was a dignified name for an animal that was going to outlive everyone's expectations. Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the foal taking his first uncertain steps on legs that weren't sure yet what they were for. "She sounds like she was practical," she said. "She was." Another pause, shorter. "She was also funny in a way that used to catch me off guard. I'd be in the middle of something serious and she'd say something and I'd—" He stopped. "It's a strange thing to miss, just being caught off guard like that." Eliza thought about her father, carrying her through mud with a twisted ankle, singing to himself while he walked. The particular shape of someone's small habits, the ones that don't seem like much until they're gone. "Not strange," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the foal. They sat in the straw with the mare between them, and the barn settled around them in its nighttime sounds. And neither of them said anything else for a while. And it was the most honest conversation they had yet had. She found out about Silas's uncle the following week, and it was not from Silas. It came from a woman named Dora Kettrick, one of the rancher's wives Eliza had spoken to in her second week of gathering information. A sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had watched Victor Hawthorne operate for 2 decades and had the memory for detail that comes from years of careful, furious paying attention. They were sitting at Dora's kitchen table with a map spread between them, and Dora was pointing to survey lines when she mentioned it, the way you mention something you've assumed the other person already knows. Of course, Hawthorne had help from inside to begin with, Dora said. The old Ashcroft connection. Eliza kept her face neutral. Which connection is that? Dora looked up. Something moved across her expression, the realization that she'd assumed wrong. You don't know. Tell me. Dora set down her pencil. Silas's uncle, his mother's brother, man named Karras, Edmund Karras. He brokered the original land deal between Hawthorne and the Garver family 20 years ago. Made a considerable amount of money doing it. There were people who said at the time that Karras had been feeding Hawthorne information about the Garver water rights before the sale, making sure Hawthorne knew what he was really buying. She paused. When Silas's parents died, Karras had a period of being involved in the ranch's affairs. Some people said he'd been the one who told Hawthorne about the Northeast Spring. Eliza sat with that for a moment. Does Silas know? I honestly couldn't tell you, Dora said. It was never proven. Karras moved east years ago. But the kind of detailed knowledge Hawthorne had about the Ashcroft water system, the specific intake points, the flow volumes, that doesn't come from standing on the outside looking in. Eliza rode home with that information sitting in her chest like a stone that had changed shape. Heavier on one side than it should be, uncomfortable, no matter how she positioned herself around it. She didn't tell Silas that night. She lay in her room with the key on the nightstand and the survey in her coat on the chair, and she thought about how to say a thing like that to a man who was already carrying a great deal of things he didn't talk about. She told him the next morning, at the kitchen table before the coffee was done, because she had decided that waiting for the right moment was a luxury, and they were short on those. She told him plainly. All of it. Dora's words as close to exactly as she could remember them. Silas listened without moving. He held his cup in both hands, and he looked at the table and he listened, and when she finished there was a silence that lasted long enough to have real weight. Karras, he said finally. Yes. I remember him being around when I was young. His voice was even, too even, in the way that things become when someone is working very hard to keep them that way. He and my mother were close. After she and my father died, he handled some of the ranch business for a season or two before I was old enough to manage it myself. He would have had access to everything, she said. Yes. Another pause. He would have. She waited. Did it change anything you're planning? He asked. Not deflecting. Genuinely asking whether this information altered the strategy she'd been building. Not the legal case, she said. But if Hawthorne has been operating with inside information since the beginning, it means he's more prepared than we thought. He may have documents we don't know about, records of communications with Karras that he could use to complicate the survey challenge. Silas nodded slowly. What do you need? She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the careful steadiness that she had come to recognize as his version of choosing to trust something, and she understood that he was not going to fall apart over this, that he was going to do what he did, which was look at the shape of the problem and ask what needed doing. I need to find out what Karras gave him, she said, and I need to talk to a lawyer before that courtroom date. The lawyer was a problem. The only practicing attorney in Harlan's Crossing who wasn't connected to Hawthorne's interests was a man named Pell, who was 63 years old, partially deaf in one ear, and had not tried a case in 4 years because, as he explained to them on the porch of his house on the edge of town, the circuit court under Judge Arbeth had made trying cases a fairly discouraging enterprise for anyone without significant financial or political backing. I know what he's doing, Pell said. He sat in a rocking chair that had seen better decades and looked at the papers Eliza had spread across the porch railing. I've watched him do it to 6 families that I know of, possibly more. The problem isn't that you don't have a case. The problem is that Arbeth will find a procedural reason to dismiss it before it can be heard. What if we could show a pattern, Eliza said, not just our survey dispute, a documented pattern of boundary manipulation across multiple properties over multiple years? Pell rocked. He looked at the papers. That would change the nature of the proceeding. If you can demonstrate systematic fraud rather than a single property dispute, you could potentially petition to have the case moved to territorial circuit, above Arbeth's court. His honor would lose jurisdiction. How hard would that petition be? Hard, Pell said. You'd need affidavits from multiple affected parties. You'd need documentary evidence, original surveys, correspondence, financial records showing the connection between the boundary changes and Hawthorne's subsequent acquisition of water rights or land. And you'd need it organized into something a territorial judge can follow in a single sitting, because you won't get two. He looked at her over the railing. It's also the kind of thing that tends to make a certain kind of man very motivated to make problems before it can be filed. He's already burned part of our barn, she said. Pell stopped rocking. He looked at Silas. Silas said, "The east corner, 3 weeks ago." Pell was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the paper at the top of the stack, a letter from one of the affected families, handwritten, describing in specific detail the sequence of events that had led to their departure from land they'd worked for a decade. "Leave these with me," he said. "Give me 2 weeks. I'll tell you if it's possible." The last week before Pell's answer was the hardest. Word had gotten into the surrounding community that the Ashcrofts were building some kind of legal challenge against Victor Hawthorne, and the response was divided in a way that told Eliza exactly what she needed to know about the kind of fear Hawthorne had cultivated. Half the families they'd spoken to quietly sent letters of support. Careful, measured, signed with real names, which took a particular kind of courage that she did not undervalue. The other half sent nothing, and 2 of them sent word through intermediaries that they were withdrawing their earlier cooperation and asking not to be contacted again. She understood. She didn't blame them, but their withdrawal created gaps in the pattern she was building, gaps that Hawthorne's lawyers would find and widen if they could. She rode out to see Dora Kettrick again on a Tuesday when the weather had gone gray and promising rain. Dora met her at the gate. "I heard you're putting together a petition," Dora said. "We are." 2 families pulled out. "I know." Dora looked at the sky. "You know what Victor Hawthorne's biggest mistake has been, all these years? Tell me." "He never thought women kept records." Dora looked back at her with something in her eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "My husband gave up after we lost the grazing rights dispute in '71. He said there was no point in holding on to paper that didn't mean anything anymore. But I kept it all. Every letter, every survey copy, every bill of sale." She paused. "Because I was angry, and I didn't have anywhere better to put it." Eliza stared at her. "Come inside," Dora said. What Dora had kept in a cedar chest under her bed for 14 years was not just records, it was a history. Letters between Hawthorne and a man she recognized now as Colt Drever, the 1861 surveyor, discussing the adjustment of boundary lines in exchange for a payment that was described in the correspondence as a consulting fee, but which anyone reading with the least amount of attention would understand was not for consulting. 3 sets of original surveys from 3 different properties, all showing the same pattern of northward boundary adjustment at the ridgelines. And 1 letter, one that Dora had saved at the very bottom of the chest, folded inside a piece of oilskin to protect it, from Victor Hawthorne to a man identified only as E.C., thanking him for the detailed information about the Ashcroft water intake and noting that it had been most useful in determining the correct approach. E.C. Edmund Karras. Eliza sat at Dora Kettrick's kitchen table with that letter in her hands and felt the shape of it all, the whole structure of what Victor had built, the years and the planning and the careful calculated patience of a man who had been doing this for so long that he had started to believe the mountain itself was cooperating. "Does Silas know you have this?" she asked. "Nobody knew I had this," Dora said. "I didn't know it mattered to anybody but me." Eliza looked at the letter. The handwriting was confident and clear, the handwriting of a man who had never imagined anyone reading his private correspondence in a courtroom. She rode back to the ranch in the rain, which had started while she was inside Dora's house and had built into something serious. A cold, persistent rain that came sideways off the ridge and made the road uncertain under the horses' hooves. She rode carefully and thought about what she was carrying and what it meant. Silas was in the barn when she arrived, finishing something with Clara's stall that he'd been meaning to fix for days. He came out when he heard the horse and looked at her face before he looked at anything else. "You found something," he said. She dismounted. She led the horse inside out of the rain and then turned to him and told him about the cedar chest and the oilskin and the letter with his uncle's initials at the top. He listened the way he always listened, still, complete, giving her the full weight of his attention. When she was done, he stood for a moment with his hand on Clara's neck and his eyes on the middle distance. "He sold us," he said. Not asking, It looks that way. A long quiet. Outside the rain came harder. Clara shifted her weight and the foal. He still didn't have a name, she realized. Neither of them had named him yet. Moved closer to his mother with the instinct of small things in loud weather. Pell needs to see that letter, she said. It may be enough to move the case above Arbeth's court. I know, he said. Silas. She waited until he looked at her. I'm sorry. About your uncle. I know that's... Don't, he said. Not harshly, just... He put one hand up slightly, a small gesture, like he was holding a door closed that he needed to stay closed for a while longer. I'll deal with it, just not right now. She nodded. She understood that. Some things needed to be looked at directly, and some things needed to be carried at a distance until there was room to set them down properly, and only the person carrying them knew which was which. We send everything to Pell tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. She went to the house and changed out of her wet clothes and stood in her room with the letter on the small desk and the rain on the window. And she thought about 14 years. 14 years Dora Kettrick had carried that paper in a cedar chest under her bed, angry and waiting, not even sure what she was waiting for. She thought about what that kind of patience looked like. The quiet, daily decision to hold on to something true in a world that kept telling you it didn't matter. She picked up the letter and looked at the handwriting, confident, clear, authored by a man who had never considered that the women around him were paying attention. He should have. He should have been paying very close attention to what the women around him kept in cedar chests and coat pockets and the backs of their careful, furious minds. Pell sent word at the end of the 2 weeks. The message was short, delivered by a boy on a fast horse who accepted payment and left before anyone could ask him questions, which suggested Pell was being careful about what roads he used and what messages he attached his name to. The message said, "It's possible. Come Thursday. Bring the Kettrick woman and everything she has." Eliza read it at the kitchen table with Silas standing at the window watching the yard, and she felt something in her chest that wasn't quite relief, because nothing was resolved and nothing was safe, and there were still 6 weeks, minus the days they'd already used, until a courtroom and a judge and a man who had been building his empire one stolen water right at a time for 20 years. But it was possible. She folded the message. "Thursday," she said. Silas nodded. He was still watching the yard, specifically, she realized, watching the road. The way you watch a road when you've learned that bad news tends to arrive on it, and you've decided that being surprised twice is one time too many. She didn't say anything else. She got up and went to the window and stood beside him, and they both looked at the road together, at the mountain above it, at the sky above that, gray and enormous and completely indifferent to the scale of what they were trying to do. The foal in the barn still had no name. She thought she might name him Thursday. Thursday came with a hard frost that turned the road to Harlan's Crossing into something that had to be negotiated rather than traveled. The horses moved carefully, their breath coming in visible clouds, and Dora Kettrick rode beside Eliza with the cedar chest secured behind her saddle, wrapped in oilskin against the cold. 14 years of careful fury finally moving toward something that had a destination. Dora had not slept the night before. She admitted it without embarrassment somewhere around the first mile, in the matter-of-fact way of a woman who had long since stopped pretending that sleep was always available on demand. "I kept thinking I should have done this sooner," she said. "You didn't have someone to do it with," Eliza said. Dora looked at her. "No," she said, "I didn't." Silas rode slightly ahead, which was his habit on roads he knew better than whoever was beside him, and Eliza watched his back against the gray morning and thought about what the day might hold and what it might not, and she kept her expectations in a place where they couldn't do too much damage if the ground shifted under them. Pell was waiting at his house rather than the office, which was the first sign that he was being deliberate about visibility. He had a fire going and 3 chairs pulled close to a table that was covered with papers arranged in a way that looked disorganized, but which, she quickly understood, was organized very precisely according to a logic that was his alone. He had a second man with him, younger, maybe 35, with ink-stained fingers and the particular attentiveness of someone who takes notes for a living. "This is Harmon," Pell said. "He writes faster than I do and doesn't repeat things he hears in this room. Harmon, the Ashcrofts and Mrs. Kettrick." Harmon nodded once and picked up his pen. They worked for 4 hours without stopping in any meaningful way. Pell went through everything: the 1859 survey, the 1861 survey, Dora's correspondence from the cedar chest, the letters from the 11 families, the timeline Eliza had constructed over the past 3 weeks that mapped Hawthorne's boundary, challenges against his subsequent acquisition of water rights. He asked precise questions and received precise answers, and when something wasn't precise, he said so and waited until it became more precise. The Hawthorne-Karras letter he handled separately. He read it 3 times and set it down and looked at the fire for a moment. "This is the piece that changes the character of the proceeding," he said. "Up to this point, we have a pattern of conduct that suggests fraud. This letter documents coordination, a specific exchange of information for financial benefit that directly precedes a specific boundary manipulation. That's not a pattern of conduct anymore. That's a conspiracy." "Can you move the case above Arbeth?" Silas asked. "I can file a petition to the territorial circuit on grounds that the local court has a demonstrated conflict of interest, and that the conduct alleged constitutes a pattern of fraud spanning multiple jurisdictions within the territory." Pell tapped the letter. "With this, I can also argue that individuals involved in the conspiracy have direct financial relationships with the sitting judge's prior campaigns, which would require Arbeth's recusal regardless." "How long does the petition take?" "If I file it before the scheduled hearing date, the territorial court can issue a stay on Arbeth's proceeding within 2 weeks. That would give us time to build the full case." He paused. "Hawthorne will know the moment I file it. He'll have someone watching the territorial court clerk the way he had someone watching Garvey here. And he'll move," Eliza said. "He'll move," Pell agreed. He looked at her steadily. "The question is what he'll move toward. A man who has burned a barn once is capable of deciding that documents are more useful destroyed than presented in court," Dora said, from the corner where she'd been sitting quietly through most of this. "I've been carrying that chest for 14 years. He can try." Nobody said anything for a moment. There was something in Dora's voice that made arguing with it feel structurally unsound. Pell filed the petition the following Monday. He sent a copy to the territorial court in the capital by the fastest available rider and kept the originals in his possession, which he moved 3 times in the next week to 3 different locations that Eliza knew about, and no one else did. It was not a comfortable week. She slept lightly and heard things in the night that turned out to be nothing. And once she got up at 2 in the morning and walked the perimeter of the ranch house in the dark, for no reason she could explain to herself other than that moving felt better than lying still. Silas found her at the south corner on her second pass. "Couldn't sleep," she said, which was unnecessary since he could see that. "No," he agreed. He fell into step beside her without asking why she was walking or whether she wanted company, which was the right response, and she noted it. They walked the rest of the perimeter together in the dark. The mountain above them was a shape against a slightly less dark sky, and the cold was the kind that you stop feeling after a while when you're moving. And by the time they'd come around to the front of the house again, she'd stopped listening for things in the dark that weren't there. "I've been thinking about Karras," Silas said. She waited. "I don't think he knew what Hawthorne would do with the information," he said. "That doesn't excuse it, but I think he probably told himself it was just business, just—" He stopped, considered. "Information that he happened to have and that someone was willing to pay for. I don't think he thought it through beyond the transaction." "That's not much of an excuse," she said. "No," he said, "it's not. But it's the difference between a man who set out to ruin something and a man who was careless with something that wasn't his to be careless with." Another pause. "I can be angry at both of those things. But I'm angrier at one than the other, and I think I need to know which one he actually was before I decide what to do with it." She thought about her father, about kindness that coexisted with recklessness, about warmth that didn't prevent damage, about the complicated ledger of a person who was neither the worst nor the best version of what you needed them to be. "That's fair," she said. He looked at her. In the dark, she could see the outline of his face and not much else, which was maybe why he said what he said next. Because the dark has a way of making certain things easier to put into the air. "You've been carrying this whole thing," he said. "The records, the families, the strategy. You've been holding it all together. You've been doing the work that keeps the ranch standing," she said. "That's not a smaller thing. It feels like a smaller thing right now." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "Silas," she said, I need this to work because if it doesn't, we lose the ranch and I have nowhere to go, and I am not particularly interested in having nowhere to go again. She said it plainly, without apology. That's not noble. That's just honest. He was quiet for a moment. I know why you're doing it, he said. I just wanted you to know I see it. She didn't have an answer for that felt right, so she didn't offer one, and they stood in the cold dark for a moment and then went back inside separately. And she lay in her room with the key on the nightstand and felt the particular strangeness of being seen by someone she hadn't expected to be seen by. And she wasn't sure yet what to do with that, so she put it in the same place she put other things she hadn't figured out yet and let it wait. The territorial court issued the stay 12 days after Pell filed the petition. The notice arrived at Pell's office by official rider on a Tuesday afternoon, and Pell sent Harmon to the ranch with a copy before the ink was dry on his own reading of it. Harmon arrived out of breath and slightly wild-eyed in the way of people who have been riding fast toward good news and are worried it might have changed by the time they get there. He handed the document to Eliza at the gate. She read it standing up. The stay suspended Arbeth's proceeding indefinitely pending a territorial review of the conflict of interest petition. The case was being transferred to the Territorial Circuit Court. A hearing date would be set within 30 days. She read it twice. Then she walked into the barn where Silas was working and handed it to him and watched him read it. When he finished, he set it down on the workbench beside him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the tool he'd been using and went back to what he'd been doing, but she noticed that his shoulders had changed. Something had gone out of them that had been there for weeks. A particular set that she recognized now as the posture of a man bracing for impact. It's not over, she said. No, he said, but it's different. She went outside. Thursday. The foal, who had been named Thursday on a morning when she was tired enough to say the first thing in her head and found she liked it, was in the small paddock adjacent to the barn, moving around the perimeter with the exploratory energy of a young thing that hasn't yet learned that the world has edges. She watched him for a while and let herself feel something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it, something tentative and not yet ready to be called by a proper name. Victor Hawthorne's response took 3 days, and it didn't come in a letter. It came in the form of a man named Aldous Cage, who arrived at the ranch on a gray afternoon riding a horse that was too good for the clothes he was wearing, which told Eliza things about him before he opened his mouth. He stopped at the gate and called out, and Silas came out of the house and stood on the porch and waited. Cage introduced himself as a representative of Mr. Hawthorne's legal interests and said he was there to discuss a settlement. Eliza came out and stood beside Silas on the porch. Cage looked at her briefly, recalibrated something in his approach, and continued. Mr. Hawthorne is prepared to drop his boundary challenge completely, Cage said. Restore the survey line to the 1859 position, relinquish any claim to the Northeast Spring, and pay a sum to cover the damages to your barn. He said all of this with the careful neutrality of a man delivering terms rather than opinions. Silas said nothing. Eliza said nothing. Cage continued. In exchange, Mr. Hawthorne asks that any and all documents related to historical boundary disputes on properties other than the Ashcroft Ranch be removed from the record being compiled for the territorial court. The petition would continue for your own case. Only the broader pattern evidence would be withdrawn. There it was, the full shape of what Victor Hawthorne was afraid of, not losing the Ashcroft water rights, not even losing the boundary case. He was afraid of the pattern. He was afraid of 14 years in a cedar chest and 11 families and a letter with a dead surveyor's name on it and another letter with a set of initials that pointed back through years of careful transaction to a web he'd been building since before either of them could have done anything about it. He didn't want the ranch. He wanted the evidence to disappear. Eliza looked at Cage. She kept her voice very level. Tell Mr. Hawthorne, she said, that we'll see him in court. Cage's expression didn't change much, but something behind it did. Mrs. Ashcroft, I want to make sure you understand what you're declining. Mr. Hawthorne is prepared to be generous. I heard what you said, she said. My answer is what I said. Cage looked at Silas. Silas said, You heard her. Cage left. She watched him ride back down the road, the way she'd watched Pruitt ride away from her father's door months ago, and the feeling was different this time. Less fear, more something she couldn't quite name, a kind of forward pressure that wasn't anger exactly, but was in the same family. He's scared, Silas said from beside her. He should be, she said. The hearing was set for the fourth week of October, in the territorial court 3 days' ride from the ranch. They made the journey in 4 days because the road through the pass was slow and the weather turned on the second day into something that required patience rather than speed. They rode with Pell, who traveled in a wagon with his papers, and Dora Kettrick, who had refused to be left behind, and Holt, who said he wasn't the sort of man who let neighbors go into a legal fight alone, and 2 of the other families who had been brave enough to sign their names and make the trip. The town that housed the territorial court was called Morrow, and it was larger than Harlan's Crossing in a way that felt less like growth and more like accumulation, the way things pile up around a fixed point over time. The courthouse was stone, substantial, the kind of building designed to communicate permanence. Eliza stood in front of it the evening before the hearing and looked at it and thought about the county clerk's office in Harlan's Crossing, where a man named Garvey had slid papers across a counter and then used his back door, and about the courthouse where she and Silas had signed their names in front of a judge reading from an invoice, and about what it meant that she was here now, outside this particular building, with this particular collection of documents in Pell's possession, and this particular collection of people at her back. She thought about her father on that cold floor with his ledgers spread around him. She thought about how small $462 had seemed to Victor Hawthorne, and how large it had seemed to her. Silas came and stood beside her. "You ready?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "Are you?" "No," he said, "but I haven't been ready for most of the things that mattered, and they happened anyway." She looked at him. He was looking at the courthouse with the same expression he used on weather, serious, attentive, not frightened exactly, but fully aware that what was in front of him was larger than he was, and that awareness was information to be used, not a reason to leave. "That's a reasonable philosophy," she said. "It's the only one I've got," he said. They went inside. The hearing room was already crowded when they arrived the next morning, which surprised her. She hadn't anticipated an audience, had imagined something closer to the empty courthouse of their wedding, just parties and lawyers and a judge. But word had traveled the way. Word travels in places where information is currency, and the benches were filled with people from across 2 counties, some of whom she recognized from her weeks of collecting affidavits, and some of whom she didn't, all of whom had apparently decided that what happened in this room was worth a 3-day ride. Victor Hawthorne sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 lawyers she didn't recognize, expensive ones by the look of their coats. And he looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had won every room he'd ever walked into and had stopped imagining the alternative. He was perhaps 60, broad across the chest, with silver hair and the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into something more than handsome. Authoritative, she thought. The face of a man who had learned that authority was more useful than charm and had invested accordingly. He glanced at her when she sat down. His eyes moved across her face the way eyes move across furniture, acknowledging the presence of an object without any particular interest in what it was. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away first, not because she was uncomfortable, but because she had nothing to say to his face yet, and she was saving what she had for when it would do more good. The territorial judge was a woman named Harston, which nobody had mentioned and which Eliza registered without showing it. Judge Harston was perhaps 50, with close-cropped gray hair and reading spectacles that she wore on a chain around her neck and deployed with the precise timing of someone who understood that where you choose to look is its own kind of statement. She settled into her seat, looked over the room with an expression that was professionally neutral and also somehow conveyed that she had heard many things in many rooms and was fully prepared to hear more, and she called the proceeding to order. Hawthorne's lawyers went first. They were good, she had to give them that. They presented the 1861 survey with confidence and explained the concept of right-of-use easement with the kind of clarity that made everything sound like settled law and obvious conclusion, and they made the argument that the Ashcroft water diversion had interfered with a usage pattern that predated the current property owner's occupation. And they spoke for almost an hour without saying anything that wasn't technically accurate and without once addressing the question of how the 1861 survey had come to exist. Judge Harston let them finish. Then she looked over her spectacles at Pell. "Counsel for the respondents." Pell stood. He was not a dramatic man and he didn't attempt drama. He simply placed documents on the table in a specific order and began explaining them in the same tone you'd use to explain the workings of a machine. Here is what this part does. Here is how it connects to that part. Here is what the whole thing produces when you run it. He started with the 1859 survey. He explained its precedents. He explained the surveyor's credentials and the chain of custody from 1859 to the cedar chest in Dora Kettrick's bedroom to this table in this room. He placed beside it a copy of the 1861 survey, and he walked the court through the specific boundary adjustments, 40 yards here, 60 there, the precise places where lines had been moved and what those movements accomplished in terms of water access. Then he placed the letter from Victor Hawthorne to Colt Drever on the table. He read it aloud. He read it completely and slowly, without inflection, in the way that certain documents are most powerful when they're simply allowed to be what they are, without anyone editorializing around them. The courtroom, which had been producing the low-grade ambient sound of a crowded room, became something much quieter. Victor Hawthorne did not move. Then Pell placed a second document on the table, the letter to E.C., to Edmund Karras, the one about information regarding the Ashcroft water intake being most useful in determining the correct approach. And he read that one too. Hawthorne's lead lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, the relevance of private correspondence—" "Sit down," Judge Harston said. She said it quietly. The lawyer sat. Pell continued. He moved through the pattern evidence methodically. The Garver property, the Kettrick grazing rights, 4 other families over 14 years, each one represented by a document, an affidavit, a survey comparison that showed the same adjusted boundary lines, the same surveyor's name, the same subsequent acquisition of water rights by Victor Hawthorne. He laid it all out on the table until the table was covered and the shape of what Victor had been building was visible in the room, fully assembled for the first time, all its pieces present. It took 2 hours. When Pell sat down, the room was very quiet. Judge Harston looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked at Victor Hawthorne. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "your counsel may respond to the pattern evidence." The lead lawyer stood. I was less composed than he'd been at the start. Not visibly rattled, but the confidence had taken on a quality that required maintenance now, rather than existing naturally. He spoke for 40 minutes about the inadmissibility of private correspondence and the difference between a business relationship with a surveyor and criminal conspiracy and the absence of direct evidence linking Hawthorne personally to boundary adjustments on properties other than the Ashcroft Range. He was not wrong that some of what he said had legal merit. She had known going in that the other families' cases would be harder to prove conclusively in a single proceeding, that the pattern was damning, but pattern alone didn't constitute proof of specific acts in a court of law. Judge Harston let him finish. Then she took off her spectacles and put them on the chain and looked at the room. "I'm going to allow a brief recess," she said, "after which I will hear directly from the parties." The recess lasted 20 minutes. Eliza spent it standing in the hallway outside the hearing room with Silas and Pell was honest about what he thought. "The letter to Drever is strong," he said. "The letter to Karras is strong for your case specifically. It establishes that Hawthorne had advanced knowledge of your water system through improper channels. The pattern evidence for the other families," he paused, choosing words with care, "is compelling as a narrative. Whether it's legally sufficient for this judge on this day is something I genuinely don't know." "What do we need?" Silas asked. "We need Hawthorne to say something in there that he can't take back," Pell said. "Something that admits the intent behind what he's been doing." Eliza looked at Pell. Then she looked at the closed doors of the hearing room. She thought about Cage's visit, the settlement offer, the specific nature of what Hawthorne had been willing to pay to make disappear. Not the boundary dispute, the pattern. "He doesn't care about the land," she said. Pell looked at her. "He said it himself, through Cage. He was willing to give up the boundary claim completely, the water rights, the barn damages, all of it. What he wanted in exchange was the pattern evidence removed from the record." She looked at Silas. "He never wanted the ranch. He wanted the water. He said it himself without meaning to." Pell was quiet for a moment. "If he could be induced to say something similar in there." "He's not going to do that voluntarily," Silas said. "No," Eliza agreed, "but he's a man who has won every room he's ever walked into. And there's a particular kind of man who, when he thinks he's winning, gets careless." She looked at the doors again. "Let me say something before Hawthorne's closing." Pell looked at her with the careful attention of a man evaluating something he hadn't planned for. "You're not a lawyer." "I'm a respondent," she said. "I have the right to address the court." Pell thought about it for a moment. "What are you going to say?" "I'm going to tell the truth," she said. and I'm going to say it in a way that makes him want to correct me. When the hearing resumed, Pell requested that Judge Harston allow the respondent to make a brief statement before closing arguments. Hawthorne's lawyer objected. Judge Harston overruled him with the expression of a woman who had not traveled to this bench to be managed. Eliza stood. She had thought about what she was going to say during the recess, and she had decided not to have it exactly prepared, because prepared had a sound to it, and she needed to sound like something else. She looked at the room, the families on the benches, Dora Kettrick's straight back, Holt's folded arms, Pell's careful attention. And then she looked at the table with all the documents on it, and then she looked at Victor Hawthorne. He looked back at her with the same furniture expression. "My father died owing $462, she said. Mr. Hawthorne consolidated that debt before his body was cold. Not because he needed the money. Everyone in 2 counties knows he didn't need the money." She kept her voice even. "He needed me married off and away from a 1/4-acre lot that sits on a creek feeding into the Ashcroft water line. That's what this has always been about. Not land, not property lines. Water." She paused. Every family represented by a document on that table lost something they'd spent years building. Some of them lost everything. But if you look at what Mr. Hawthorne gained from each of those disputes, not the land itself, because he rarely kept the land, what he gained was water access, every single time. The land was just the mechanism. She let that sit for a moment. He said so himself through his representative 3 weeks ago when he offered to drop his boundary challenge and pay for our barn damage in exchange for removing the pattern evidence from this proceeding. Because the land doesn't matter to him, the water matters. And the pattern shows that clearly enough that he was willing to pay substantially to make it disappear. Victor Hawthorne moved for the first time since she'd started speaking. It was a small movement, a slight shift, his shoulders adjusting, but she'd been watching for it. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, and the directness of addressing him brought his eyes fully to hers. "The survey on that table from 1859 shows that the Northeast Spring has always been on Ashcroft land. The letter on that table shows that you knew it and chose to adjust the record rather than accept it. And the 13 years between those two things show what that choice cost people who didn't have the resources to fight you in a room like this one." She sat down. The room was quiet. Victor Hawthorne leaned toward his lead lawyer. Something was exchanged between them in a low voice, and the lawyer's posture changed in a way that she recognized. The posture of a man who has just been told to do something he doesn't think is tactically sound, but who is going to do it anyway because the man paying him wants it done. The lawyer stood for his closing. He was controlled and precise, and he addressed the legal insufficiency of the pattern evidence with careful arguments. And then, at the end, in a section that felt slightly disconnected from the rest of what he'd said, slightly improvised, he said that Mr. Hawthorne wished the court to understand that the Northeast Spring, while legally contested, was not in fact essential to Mr. Hawthorne's operations in any material sense, that the entire basis of the Ashcroft water claim had been overstated in these proceedings, and that Mr. Hawthorne had pursued this matter primarily as a matter of property rights principle rather than any specific interest in water acquisition. Pell, beside her, wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it toward her. It said, "He just said he never wanted the water." She wrote back, "I know." She looked at Hawthorne. He was looking at the table. For the first time in the proceeding, he was not looking at the room. Judge Harston asked both parties for final written submissions within 10 days and said she would issue a ruling within 30. She recessed the court, and the room began the complicated business of a crowd trying to move through a space not quite large enough for it. In the noise and movement, Eliza sat still for a moment at the respondent's table. She felt the weight of the day leaving her body in stages, like water draining from a container, first the shoulders, then the chest, then something lower that she hadn't been aware was holding itself tight until it stopped. Silas sat down in the chair beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there while the room moved around them, close enough that she could hear him breathe, and that was its own kind of statement. Dora Kettrick stopped at the table on her way out. She looked at Eliza, and her expression was the one that was adjacent to a smile, but wasn't quite. "You made him deny wanting the thing he's been taking for 20 years, Dora said, on the record, in front of a territorial judge." "He made himself deny it," Eliza said. "I just gave him the room." Dora put her hand briefly on Eliza's shoulder. Not a lingering thing, just a touch. The duration of something that doesn't need to be long to mean something. Then she walked out. Holt passed the table on his way out and said nothing but put his hat on in a particular way that conveyed respect, and she recognized that too. Outside the courthouse, in the October cold, Pell stood with his papers gathered and told them what he thought would happen, that Harston would rule in their favor on the Ashcroft boundary dispute, that the pattern evidence was less certain, but that Hawthorne's lawyer's closing statement had complicated his client's position considerably, and that at minimum there would be further proceedings for the other families that hadn't been possible before today. "You don't know the ruling yet," Silas said. "No," Pell agreed, "but I've been doing this a long time. I know what a judge looks like when she's already decided." He picked up his bag. She'd decided by the time Mrs. Ashcroft sat down. He walked toward his wagon, and Eliza stood in the cold outside the stone courthouse with Silas beside her and looked at the mountains visible at the edge of the town. Different mountains than theirs, same sky above them. "He denied wanting the water," she said. "On record. His lawyer said it." "I heard," Silas said. "If the ruling goes to us on the boundary dispute, the water rights argument collapses, and the territorial court can use today's record in any subsequent proceeding against him for the other families." "I know," he said. "You did that." She started to say she hadn't done it alone, but he held up one hand slightly, the same small gesture he'd used when she'd tried to talk about his uncle in the barn. "You did that," he said again, and the repetition had a quality of finality to it, a closing of a certain kind of accounting, and she accepted it the way you accept something that costs the person offering it something real. They stayed one more night in Morrow and rode home the following morning, Pell and Dora and Holt and the others spreading out along the road at various points, each turning toward their own homes. And by midday it was just the two of them on the mountain road in the October cold, the ranch somewhere ahead of them, around the curve she'd learned over months of riding this same road. She thought about the first time she'd ridden it, in August, sitting beside a driver who didn't talk, watching the landscape get wilder and wondering whether she was making the worst decision she'd ever made or the only one available. She still didn't know if it had been both. She thought it might have been both, and that both could be true simultaneously without either canceling the other out. Thursday was in the paddock when they got home, considerably larger than he'd been when they left, with the opinionated energy of a young horse who has decided that fences are more of a suggestion than a rule. He spotted them coming through the gate and came to the fence line and made his views on their absence known. Silas got off his horse and went to the paddock fence and put his hand out, and Thursday pressed his nose against it and held it there. Eliza watched that for a moment from the gate, the mountain above them, the last light on the rock face, the color between gold and amber that still didn't have a name in any language she knew. The ranch in its state of ongoing repair, better than it had been in August, not what it might eventually become, working towards something in the middle distance that wasn't fixed yet but was visible. 30 days for the ruling, possibly more proceedings after that. Nothing resolved in the clean, permanent way that you imagined things resolving when you were hoping for them hard enough. But she had said, "I live here in the dark" 3 months ago, and she had meant it then without knowing she meant it. And standing here now, she meant it in a way that was fully deliberate and had examined itself and was not surprised by what it found. The key was in her pocket. It had been in her pocket every day since the first night, carried not because she needed it, she hadn't locked her door in weeks, but because it was the first thing on this mountain that had been given to her without condition, and she was not in the habit of putting down things like that. She unsaddled her horse and led him to the water trough. The trough was full. The water from the northeast spring ran where it was supposed to run, down through the repaired pipes, cold and steady and belonging to nobody who had tried to take it. For now. Silas came and stood at the other side of the trough while their horses drank. 30 days, she said. 30 days, he agreed. The horses drank. The mountain held its own counsel, the way mountains do. The light went the rest of the way down, and the dark came up to meet it, and the ranch settled into the sounds of a place that had people in it who were staying. The ruling came on the 26th day, not the 30th, which meant Judge Harston had made up her mind before the 10-day submission period had even closed, and had simply waited a decent interval before saying so. Pell sent Harmon with the document. Harmon arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon looking considerably calmer than his last visit, which told Eliza something before she'd read a word. He handed her the sealed envelope at the gate and accepted a cup of water and didn't say anything, which was its own form of professionalism, letting the document speak rather than narrating it. She read it standing at the gate in the November cold with Harmon waiting and Silas coming across the yard from the direction of the barn, having seen a rider arrive from wherever he'd been working. Judge Harston's ruling was 22 pages. Eliza read the summary first, which was the last 2 pages, and then she read the first page, and then she stood still for a moment with the document in both hands. The boundary dispute was resolved in favor of the Ashcroft Ranch. The 1859 survey was recognized as the controlling document. The Northeast Spring and its intake infrastructure fell entirely within Ashcroft land as originally surveyed. The 1861 survey, submitted by Victor Hawthorne, was found to have been produced under circumstances that, while not conclusively fraudulent within the scope of this proceeding, were sufficiently irregular to render it inadmissible as a controlling instrument. The water diversion channel on the northeast ridge was ordered removed within 60 days at the responsible party's expense. Additionally, and this was the part that made her read it twice, Judge Harston had included a formal referral to the Territorial Attorney's Office, recommending investigation into the broader pattern of boundary manipulation documented in the record, specifically citing the Drever correspondence and the letter to Edmund Karras as items warranting further legal scrutiny. The referral was not a verdict. It was not a conviction. But it was a door opened by someone with the authority to open it, and that was something different from anything that had existed before today. Silas reached her side and she handed him the document without speaking. She watched him read. He reads slowly, the way he did everything, completely, without rushing toward the conclusion before he'd gone through everything that preceded it. When he finished, he held the pages for a moment without returning them. "The referral," he said. "Yes. That's for the other families." "That's for the other families," she agreed. Harmon, who had been standing at a respectful distance, spoke up. "Mr. Pell said to tell you he's already been contacted by 2 of the families about retaining him for subsequent proceedings. He said," Harmon checked the mental note he was clearly working from. "He said to tell Mrs. Ashcroft specifically that the door she opened is still open." She thought about Dora Kettrick's cedar chest, 14 years under a bed, waiting for a room where it could matter. "Tell him we know," she said. Harmon left. She and Silas stood at the gate with the ruling in his hands and the mountain above them doing what it always did, which was nothing and everything simultaneously, existing at a scale that made human legal proceedings feel small and also somehow more important because of that smallness. The fact that small things had to be fought for precisely because the world was large and indifferent and didn't do it for you. "It's over," she said. Then she corrected herself. "Our part of it." "For now," he said. "For now," she agreed. She expected to feel more. She wasn't sure what more was supposed to look like. Some definitive internal shift, some clean emotional resolution that matched the resolution on the page in his hands. What she actually felt was tired in a way that wasn't unpleasant and hungry, and aware of the fact that there were approximately 9 things that needed doing on the property that she had been deferring because the legal proceedings had absorbed the part of her attention that those tasks required. "I need to check the south fence line," she said. "The 3rd post from the creek bend was loose when I looked at it last week." Silas looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, because Silas Ashcroft had not yet produced a full smile in her presence, and she had stopped expecting one as a standard feature of his expression, but something in the neighborhood of one, something that happened to the corners of his mouth and the area around his eyes, and lasted about 2 seconds before it was gone. "I already fixed it," he said. "Yesterday." She looked at him. "When were you going to tell me?" "Just now," he said. She almost laughed. She felt it come up and then she let it, which was something she didn't do often because laughter required a kind of openness that she'd been rationing since her father's floor and the ledgers and the 11 days that had changed the shape of her life. But standing at the gate with the ruling in her husband's hands and a fixed fence post she hadn't known about, she let it happen. It wasn't a big laugh. It was short and genuine, and it surprised her more than it surprised him, she thought, which said something about the fact that he'd been paying attention to the shape of who she was in a way that she hadn't fully accounted for. She stopped. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a word for yet. "Yet we should tell Dora," she said. "We should," he said. They rode to Dora Kettrick's place the following morning with a copy of the ruling. Dora read it at her kitchen table in the same chair she'd been sitting in when she'd told Eliza about Edmund Karras. Same chair, same table, different weight in the room. She read it thoroughly, turned it over to look at the back for reasons that were probably habit, and then set it down. She looked at the referral section for a long time. "The attorney's office," she said. "Yes." "That means they'll look at the Garver sale," Dora said, "and the Kettrick grazing rights dispute." She said the last phrase in a way that contained 20 years of having said it differently, quietly, privately, in the voice of someone who had learned not to say it out loud to people who couldn't do anything about it. "They'll look at all of it." "They'll look at all of it," Eliza confirmed. Dora was quiet. She put her hand flat on the copy of the ruling and kept it there for a moment, like she was taking a temperature. "I want you to know something," Dora said. She looked up at Eliza. "I kept that chest because I was angry, and I didn't want to lose the anger, because the anger was the only thing that felt true in a situation where nothing else did. I wasn't keeping it for anyone else. I was keeping it for myself." A pause. "But it turned out to be for other people too, and I didn't know that until you came and sat at this table, and I want you to know that matters to me." Eliza thought about what to say. She said what was true. "You kept the evidence. We just found a room for it." Dora looked at her. The thing that was adjacent to a smile was fully present now, and then it shifted into the actual thing, and it was a real smile, worn and genuine and complicated in the way that real smiles sometimes are when they've been a long time coming. She poured 3 cups of coffee, and they sat at the table together, the 3 of them, Dora and Eliza and Silas, who had been standing in the doorway until Dora waved him toward a chair with the authority of a woman in her own kitchen, and they drank the coffee and talked for an hour about things that were not the court case. The coming winter, the state of the road through the pass, Dora's 2 horses, one of whom had opinions about saddle blankets that she found personally offensive. Thursday's growth rate, which Eliza reported was alarming. It was an ordinary conversation. She noticed it as such, the ordinariness of it, the way it felt like something that could happen again, that wasn't underlaid with urgency or strategy or the particular quality of attention you maintain when you're watching for the next threat. Just people in a warm kitchen in November talking about horses and roads and winter. She hadn't had that in a long time. The news about Victor Hawthorne reached them 10 days later through Holt, who had heard it from a man coming through from Harlan's Crossing. Victor had neither appeared publicly nor communicated through lawyers since the ruling had been issued. His house, which was the largest in 2 counties, and had always been maintained with the particular intensity of a man who wanted the size of his property to make a statement, had been closed up. Staff dismissed. Horses moved to a facility in the next county. "He's left," Holt said. "I was standing in the Ashcroft yard with his hat in his hand, which was how he delivered things he wanted to be taken seriously. Rumor is he went east, whether for good or just while the attorney's investigation runs, nobody seems to know." Silas received this in silence. Eliza thought about the moment in the courtroom when his lawyer had denied wanting the water. She thought about what it must have cost a man like Victor Hawthorne to authorize that sentence. A man for whom the whole architecture of his position depended on the room understanding that he got what he wanted. To have his lawyer stand in a territorial court and say on record that he'd never particularly wanted the thing he'd spent 20 years taking. She felt something she wanted to be satisfaction and found it wasn't quite. Satisfaction, she was discovering, was cleaner than what you actually felt when something concluded that had been ugly and long. What you actually felt was more complicated. Relief mixed with the residue of everything that had happened to get here, an awareness of the people who hadn't made it to this side of it, the families who'd left and couldn't come back regardless of what the attorney's office found. "What about the investigation?" she asked Holt. "Pell says it'll take the better part of a year," Holt said. "Maybe longer. The territorial attorney's office has to go through the Garver sale documents, the surveying contracts, financial records. It's a lot of paper going back a long time. But it's happening." "It's happening," he confirmed. After Holt left, she stood in the yard for a while. The air had the smell of coming snow, a particular quality, almost metallic, that she'd learned to recognize over these months on the mountain. The sky was the color of old pewter. Silas came out of the barn. "It's going to snow tonight," she said. "I know," he said. He stood beside her and they both looked at the sky. "The east pasture fence. I checked it this morning." He looked at her. "Third and fourth posts from the water trough," she said. They were fine. Something happened to his expression. That 2-second thing that wasn't quite a smile, that she'd stopped trying to name and had started simply noting with the quiet attention you give to something you want to remember accurately. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." She followed him in. The letter from Edmund Karras arrived in December, forwarded through a postal office 2 states east to Pell's address, which meant Karras had known enough to avoid sending it directly, and had also known, somehow, that there was a lawyer involved, which meant he'd been following events from wherever he'd gone in the years since he'd left the territory. The letter was addressed to Silas. Pell sent it unopened, which Eliza thought well of him for. Silas read it alone, which she understood without being told. She went outside and did the things that needed doing: water for the horses, a loose board on the north outbuilding that had been making noise in the wind for a week. And when she came back inside, he was sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him and a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. She took her coat off and hung it and sat down across from him and waited. "He says he didn't know what Hawthorne would do with the information," Silas said. "He says he thought it was—" He looked at the letter briefly, then back at her. "An informal business exchange that would affect water easement negotiations, not property boundaries. He says he didn't know about the surveying. Do you believe him?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "I think he told himself that," he said finally. "I think he believed it enough to accept the money without looking too hard at what it was for." He picked up the coffee cup and set it down without drinking. "I don't know if that's believing it or choosing not to know the difference." "Those are different things," she said. "They are," he said. "But I'm not sure the damage comes out different at the end." She thought about her father's ledgers, about the way Thomas Rowan had borrowed money with what was probably genuine intention of repaying it, had probably told himself each time that this was the last time, had probably believed it enough to sign the papers, and had left his daughter with $462 of consequence regardless of the quality of his intentions. "No," she said. "The damage doesn't." Silas looked at the letter. "He's asking whether I want to speak with him. He says he'd understand if I didn't." "What do you want?" The question sat in the room for a moment. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life being angry at a man who made a bad choice for money and probably doesn't sleep well," Silas said. "That's not the same as forgiving him, but it's also not nothing." She looked at him. This was one of the things she'd come to understand about Silas Ashcroft over these months. That the silence wasn't absence of thought. It was the evidence of thought so thorough that by the time it came out as words, it had already been through everything it needed to go through. He didn't say things he hadn't meant. He didn't perform wisdom. He just arrived at it, slowly, on his own schedule, and when he arrived, it was real. "Write back if you want to," she said. "Don't if you don't. That's simple." "It's your choice," she said. "Nobody else's." He folded the letter. He put it in his shirt pocket. She didn't know what he eventually decided. She never asked, because it wasn't her territory. But 3 weeks later, she noticed a sealed envelope on the table near the door that disappeared the next morning, and she understood that he'd made his decision and moved on it, and that was enough. The snow that had been threatening since November arrived properly in January and stayed. The mountain under snow was a different place from the mountain in summer, quieter at the surface, more active underneath, the cold doing things to the land that you understood intellectually, but that still surprised you when you experienced them daily. Pipes that needed insulating, horses that needed more feed and more attention, fences that became treacherous rather than merely difficult. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't mind it. She had grown up in a house with leaking roofs and insufficient heat, and a father who meant well and planned badly, and winter had always felt like something to endure. Here it felt like something to manage, which was different, the difference between being at the mercy of something and being in negotiation with it. She and Silas developed a winter rhythm, which was different from their working rhythm in the warmer months, closer quarters, more time in the house, adjustments in the ordinary choreography of two people sharing a space. She learned that he made coffee too strong by any reasonable standard and that pointing this out produced no results. He learned that she reorganized things when she was thinking about something difficult, and that asking what she was thinking about was less useful than simply following the trail of reorganized items to understand the approximate shape of the problem. They argued for the first time properly in February about whether to sell 2 of the horses to cover a supply shortage that both of them had different opinions about the severity of. It was not a polite disagreement. She said things that were too sharp, and he said things that were too few, which was its own kind of sharpness. And they went to their separate rooms and didn't speak for most of an evening. She lay in her room. She still had her room, still had the key, though the key had been on the nightstand rather than in her pocket for months, and she thought about what she'd said and what she'd meant and what the difference was. She got up and knocked on his door. He opened it. "I was wrong about the timing," she said. "Not wrong about the horses. We shouldn't sell them. But I was wrong that we had to decide tonight." He looked at her. "You were right that the supply shortage is real." "I know I was. I was wrong that waiting would help." "We were both partly wrong," she said. He nodded. Then he said, "You want coffee?" "Your coffee is terrible," she said. "Yes," he said, and went to make it. She sat at the kitchen table while he made the coffee and thought about what it meant to build something with a person. Not the grand, deliberate version of that, not the version you planned in advance and executed according to the plan, but the actual version, which was made of fixed fence posts and argued decisions, and coffee that was too strong in the way his shoulders changed when something stopped being a threat, and 14-year-old letters in cedar chests, and a key carried in a pocket long past the point of needing it, and a foal named Thursday who was growing into something considerable. She thought about a girl sitting on a cold floor with a dead man in the next room, doing arithmetic twice the way she'd been taught, getting the same answer both times. She thought about a letter she'd written at a kitchen table that she'd almost burned. She thought about, "Come Saturday. We'll see." The territorial attorney's investigation concluded in the late spring of the following year, 14 months after the ruling, which was longer than Pell had predicted and shorter than some of the families had feared. The findings were substantial. Colt Drever had been dead for 3 years, which complicated certain aspects of the prosecution, but the documentary record he and Hawthorne had produced together was sufficient to establish a pattern of deliberate boundary fraud across 9 separate properties over 18 years. Victor Hawthorne, who had not returned to the territory during the investigation, settled rather than face a territorial criminal proceeding, a settlement that involved significant financial restitution to affected families, forfeiture of water rights he'd acquired through the manipulated boundaries, and a permanent bar from acquiring property in the territory. He would not be coming back. Pell sent the details in a letter that was 12 pages and thorough, and the financial restitution amounts that applied to individual families were specific and, in some cases, substantial enough to matter. Not to undo what had been taken, because nothing financial undoes time and loss and the particular grief of leaving a place you built, but to matter in the way that acknowledgement matters when it comes with something real attached to it. The Garver family's descendants received the largest share. They were located through the attorney's process in a town 2 states away, and when the letter reached them, Pell told Eliza this part later, the woman who received it was the daughter of the man who had originally lost the land, who had been 12 years old when her family had loaded a wagon and driven away from a property her father had never stopped talking about for the rest of his life. She was in her 30s now, and she cried when she read the letter, which Pell reported without editorializing, and Eliza received that information and sat with it for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be 12 years old and watch your father drive away from the thing he'd built, and what it did to a person to carry that, and what a piece of paper could and couldn't undo about it. She thought about what it meant that Dora Kettrick had been so angry for so long that she'd kept every document and never thrown any of them away, not knowing who would eventually need them, just knowing that someone should. She thought about all the things that get preserved by the people who are too angry to stop caring, and what would be lost if those people ever managed to put their anger down. On the morning she heard about the Garver settlement, she went out to the paddock where Thursday was living now, too large for the small enclosure he'd started in, with the emphatic physical presence of a horse who had decided that the world was an interesting place, and he intended to investigate all of it. She leaned on the fence and watched him move and thought about Clara, who was older now, and had slowed slightly in her movement in a way that spoke of years rather than decline, and about the night she and Silas had sat in the straw on opposite sides of a stall, while a difficult thing resolved into a living one, and a man had told her what it felt like to miss being caught off guard by someone. She heard Silas come up behind her and lean on the fence beside her. "The Garver settlement," she said. "Holt told me this morning," he said. They watched Thursday perform an opinion about a corner of the paddock he'd apparently only just noticed. "Dora wants to plant something," Eliza said, "with her portion. She told me last week. She said she's wanted an orchard for 20 years and she kept not doing it, because every time she thought about the future, she thought about the case and she couldn't see past it. What kind of orchard? Apple, mostly. Some pear. She said she wants it to take 20 years to mature because she's planning to be there for it. Eliza paused. She's 63. Good math, Silas said. She said the same thing. Eliza looked at the mountain above them, the same mountain that had been there since the first morning, since the first view from her window, when she hadn't known yet what any of this would cost or what it would turn into. The Holt boys want to expand their cattle operation now that the water situation's resolved. They asked if we'd be willing to discuss shared grazing access on the east pasture in the dry season. What did you tell them? I told them I'd talk to you first. He looked at her sideways. And? And I think we should do it, she said, with clear terms in writing, boundaries, seasonal limits, maintenance responsibilities. Everything in writing, he said, because paper matters, she said. We know that now. We do, he said. She turned and looked at the ranch, the full extent of it from where they stood. The main house, more solid than it had been in August of the previous year, because they had fixed what needed fixing and left the rest to wait its turn. The barn, its east corner rebuilt from the ground up, the new wood slightly brighter than the rest, and gradually darkening toward the same weathered gray. The south fence, all 4 miles of it, holding. The garden plot, which she had reclaimed in the spring and which had produced more than she'd expected and less than she'd hoped, which seemed about right for first efforts. It was not beautiful in any postcard sense. It was functional and imperfect and marked by repair, the kind of place that shows its history on its surface because there's been too much living in it to hide. She had come to understand that this was not a flaw. There was a man who wanted to buy the timber rights, she said. He came through in April while you were at the Holt place. I didn't mention it. Silas looked at her. He was representing an eastern company, she said. They wanted to harvest the upper slope timber. He quoted a figure that was, she paused, significant. What did you tell him? I told him we weren't interested. She had said it before she'd thought about it, actually, in the same way she'd said I live here in the dark, out of some part of herself that had already done the calculus before she'd consciously arrived at it. Then I thought about whether I should have talked to you first, and I decided what I'd told him was right regardless. It is right, Silas said immediately. She looked at him. You don't want to hear the figure? No, he said. The timber stays. She nodded. She'd known that was what he would say. She'd probably known it before she'd told the man no, which was why she hadn't mentioned it until now. Not to hide it, but because she'd needed to see whether her own answer matched what she understood of his. And it had, and that was a thing worth noting. There's something I want to ask you, she said. He waited. She'd been thinking about how to say this for a while. She'd tried several versions in the privacy of her own mind and found them all inadequate in different ways. Too formal, or too soft, or too much like something someone had written down rather than thought through. She'd eventually decided to say it the way she said most things to him, which was plainly. This started as a transaction, she said. You know that, I know that. We both walked into that courthouse understanding what it was. Yes, he said. I don't experience it that way anymore, she said. And I'm not sure when that changed. I don't have a specific day I can point to. She thought about it. The barn fire. The straw on the floor of the stall. The kitchen table with ledgers between them and a lamp. Walking the perimeter in the dark. Coffee that was too strong every morning without exception. I just know that it changed. He was looking at her with an attention that was different from his usual attention, more directly present, less like weather assessment, and more like something that didn't have a practical function and was happening anyway. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to feel... She started. Eliza, he said. He said it in the way he said things when he meant them precisely and completely. I know, because it changed for me too. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and that was all right, because they had spent enough time together by now that silence between them didn't need filling. Then he said, the key. She blinked. What? You still carry it, he said. The key to your room. You've had it in your pocket every day since the first night. I've seen you reach for it sometimes when something's difficult. She had not known he'd noticed. She should have known. Silas Ashcroft did not miss things that happened in his vicinity. But she had not been thinking of the key as something observable, just as a weight she carried because it had started as a reassurance and had become something else that she hadn't fully named. "It's the first thing anyone gave me on this mountain," she said, without asking for something in return. He was quiet. Then, "It doesn't need to be a separate room." She looked at him. "Unless you want it to be," he said. "That part doesn't change unless you want it to." "But I wanted to say—" He paused, and she understood that he was doing the thing he did, making sure the words were right before he committed them to air. "That I'd like for you to have somewhere that doesn't need a lock, if that's something you want." She thought about the first night, lying in a strange bed in a strange house on a mountain at the end of the strangest day of her life, locking a door not because she was afraid, but because she could. What that had meant then, what it meant now. She reached into her coat pocket. The key was there, as always. Warm from proximity to her body, smooth from months of handling. She took it out and looked at it. She put it in his hand, not as surrender, not as a transaction, the way the first exchange had been, just as a choice, freely made, without debt or deadline or any external pressure pointing her in a particular direction. His hand closed around it. She looked at the mountain. November was coming again, and the light was already doing the thing it did in the late weeks of autumn on the high elevation, going gold earlier in the afternoon and lasting longer than summer light, spreading wide across the rock face in the color she had never found a name for. Thursday was still investigating the corner of his paddock. Clara watched him with the specific patience of a horse who has seen a great deal and has opinions about none of it. "The Holt boys will want an answer on the grazing agreement before spring," she said. "We'll write it up in January," he said, "when the weather keeps us inside anyway. Pell will want to review it. Pell will want to add 3 pages, Silas said. We'll let him." She almost laughed again. She let herself. They stood at the paddock fence together as the light moved across the mountain, and she thought about the things that endure. Not the grand ones, not the monuments, but the small, persistent ones. Dora Kettrick's fury, careful enough to be useful 20 years later. A cedar chest under a bed. A drawer of ledgers on a cold floor that had sent a frightened girl toward the only door available, and she had walked through it, and it had led here. A foal-born sideways in a difficult hour who was now a horse with substantial opinions about the world. She thought about what she would tell someone who asked her how you build a life when you've been handed the ruins of one. And what she'd tell them was that you don't do it by making it perfect. You do it by staying in the room when the room is difficult. You do it by carrying things that matter until you find someone trustworthy enough to carry them with you. You do it imperfectly and slowly, and sometimes you argue about horses, and the coffee is too strong every single morning, and the fences are always breaking somewhere, and that is not a failure of the life. That is the life. The key was in his pocket now, and hers was empty, and that was all right. She hadn't needed it as a lock in a long time. She had just needed to know it was hers. The mountain stood above them in the November light, the same as it had been on the first evening when she'd stood at her window and watched the pine trees move. It had been here before either of them, and would be here after, keeping its own record of the things that happened at its base. The water that ran where it was supposed to run. The families who had stayed and the ones who had been driven out, and the ones who might come back now that the reason for their leaving had been called to account. She had arrived here with nothing but a letter she'd almost burned and a determination not to be one more thing that Victor Hawthorne's money moved out of its place. She was still here. The ranch was still here. The water ran in the pipe on the northeast ridge, cold and present, and belonging to the people who had fought to keep it. That was not a small thing. She had learned, in the year since August and the courthouse and come Saturday, we'll see, that small things and large things were not always distinguishable at the moment they were happening. Sometimes the thing that changes everything looks like a letter. Sometimes it looks like a key. Sometimes it looks like an old woman pulling a cedar chest out from under her bed and saying, "Nobody knew I had this." She kept that. She kept all of it, in the part of her that had learned from her father's ledgers and from Dora Kettrick's fury and from a man who spoke less than the wind and meant every word of it, that what you choose to hold on to and what you choose to let go is the closest thing there is to writing your own story. She reached over and took his arm. Not dramatically. Just placed her hand in the crook of his elbow the way you do when you're standing next to someone you plan to keep standing next to. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. Thursday made a noise from the paddock. Clara ignored it. The light went slowly the rest of the way down, and the first star appeared over the eastern ridge, and the mountain held everything in its old, enormous silence, and the ranch below it went on being what it was, imperfect, worked, and there.